Sometimes a child's innocent heart can see what grown-ups have forgotten, that beneath all our differences, we're just people looking for home. In a small frontier town, 7-year-old Melody walks up to Ashki, an Apache warrior everyone fears, and simply takes his hand. "Follow me home," she says quietly. The town watches as this little girl leads away the man they call dangerous. But Melody knows something they don't. She's not just looking for someone to protect her. Hidden in her small request is a truth about mercy, forgiveness, and a bond. That happened long ago. This abandoned child holds a secret that will change everything both peoples believed about their past. What could a little girl possibly know that would bring a hardened Apache warrior to his knees? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer of 1882 pressed down on Cedar Ridge like a heavy blanket, the kind that made horses hang their heads and men seek shade wherever they could find it. Dust devils danced across the main street, stirring up memories and regrets in equal measure. This was frontier country, perched on the edge of Apache territory, where two worlds met but rarely mingled, like oil and water in the same basin. The town consisted of weathered wooden buildings that had seen better days, their paint peeling like old skin. The general store anchored one end of Main Street, while the saloon held down the other, and between them stretched the careful distance that defined most relationships in Cedar Ridge. People kept to their own kind here, spoke in careful whispers about the Indian problem, and taught their children to fear what they didn't understand. 7-year-old Melody McKenna sat on the porch steps of her aunt and uncle's house, watching the world with eyes that seemed too old for her small face. Her hair fell in auburn waves past her shoulders, catching the late afternoon light, and her dress, hand-me-down blue cotton that had seen better days, hung loose on her thin frame. She had been living with her mother's sister Ruth and Ruth's husband Thomas for nearly a year now, ever since the wagon accident that supposedly claimed both her parents on the trail from Kansas. "Melody, get inside before someone sees you just sitting there," Ruth called from the doorway, her voice carrying that familiar edge of worry and frustration. "Decent girls don't lounge about where everyone can gawk." But Melody remained still, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. She had developed a habit of watching, of seeing things others missed or chose to ignore, like how Mrs. Patterson hurried her children past the Apache trading post without looking back, or how Sheriff Coleman's hand always rested on his gun when any of the native people came to town for supplies. Ruth emerged onto the porch, wiping flour-dusted hands on her apron. She was a woman worn down by frontier life, her face lined with premature age from sun and worry. "Child, I swear you hear nothing I say. Thomas will be home soon, and he doesn't need to see you sitting out here like some kind of—" "Like what, Aunt Ruth?" Melody asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. Like her mother. Catherine McKenna had been the kind of woman who asked too many questions, showed too much kindness to the wrong people, and paid the price for both. Ruth's expression softened slightly. "Come inside, dear. Help me with supper." The McKenna house felt smaller each day, its walls pressing in on Melody with unspoken rules and careful silences. Ruth meant well, but she had her own children to worry about, twin boys who took after their father in both looks and temperament. They treated Melody with the polite distance of distant relatives, never cruel but never warm, as if afraid that whatever had marked her family might be catching. Thomas McKenna arrived home as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, his boots heavy on the wooden steps. He was a decent man, Melody supposed, but one who believed in clear lines between right and wrong, us and them. He worked at the bank and served on the town council, positions that required a certain kind of respectability. "Evening, Ruth." "Melody." He nodded to each in turn, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Council meeting ran long tonight. Lot of discussion about the Apache situation." Ruth served dinner in the careful silence that had become their routine. Boiled potatoes, salt pork and bread that she made fresh each morning. Simple food for simple people living simple lives. Except nothing about life in Cedar Ridge was truly simple. What kind of discussion, Ruth asked, passing Thomas the butter. The territorial government's putting pressure on us to resolve things one way or another. Can't have uncertainty when the railroad's planning to come through. Thomas cut his meat with precise movements. Some folks think it's time to push them off the reservation entirely, move them further south. Melody listened without appearing to, a skill she had perfected over the past year. Adults often forgot that children had ears when they got caught up in their important conversations. What about the peaceful ones? Ruth asked. Surely there's some that don't cause trouble. Thomas paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. Ruth, you can't think of them that way. They're not like us. They don't understand property rights, don't respect boundaries. Even the peaceful ones, they're just waiting for their chance. But Melody's mother always said, Catherine said a lot of things, Thomas interrupted, his voice carrying a warning. And look where it got her. The silence that followed felt heavy as a thundercloud. Ruth busied herself cutting bread, while Melody stared at her plate, remembering fragments of conversations she wasn't supposed to have heard. Her mother had been different, had believed things that other people in town found dangerous or foolish. After dinner, Melody helped Ruth wash dishes, while Thomas read his newspaper by lamplight. The routine provided comfort even when nothing else did. But tonight felt different somehow, charged with the kind of tension that came before storms. Aunt Ruth, Melody said quietly as she dried a plate, what really happened to my parents? Ruth's hand stilled in the soapy water. You know what happened, dear. The wagon accident on the trail. A terrible tragedy. But people whisper things, about Mama especially. Ruth turned to face her, water dripping from her hands. People whisper about everything in a town this size. Most of it's just idle talk, nothing more. They say she was friends with Indians, that she helped them somehow. The plate Ruth was washing slipped from her hands, clattering against the wash basin. Melody McKenna, you shouldn't repeat such gossip. Your mother was a good Christian woman who sometimes had too much sympathy for her own good. That's all. But Melody heard the tremor in her aunt's voice, saw the way her eyes wouldn't quite meet hers. She had learned to read these signs over the past year, the careful words that said one thing while meaning another. Later that night, as she lay in the small bed in the corner of the main room, Melody listened to her aunt and uncle talking in low voices from their bedroom. We can't keep her much longer, Ruth, Thomas was saying. The boys are getting older, asking questions. And with all this talk about the Apache, people remember Catherine's reputation. She's just a child, Thomas. Where would she go? There's an orphanage in Santa Fe. Good Christian people who could give her proper schooling, teach her appropriate ways. It might be better for everyone, including her. A long pause. Including her. Melody closed her eyes and tried to imagine this orphanage, this place where she might learn to be appropriate. But all she could picture was more walls, more careful silences, more people who would look at her and see Catherine McKenna's daughter, whatever that meant to them. She must have dozed because she woke to the sound of horses outside. Through the window, she could see torches moving in the darkness, men gathering in the street, their voices carried on the night air, angry and urgent. Seen riding near the Hendricks place again. Can't let them think they can just time to send a message. Thomas emerged from the bedroom pulling on his boots. Stay inside, both of you, he told Ruth. This doesn't concern us. But Melody crept to the window anyway, watching as more men joined the group. She recognized most of them, store owners, farmers, men who smiled and nodded politely during the day, but gathered with torches when darkness fell. The next morning brought news that traveled through town like wildfire. An Apache warrior had been spotted near several homesteads, apparently alone, but armed. No one had been hurt, nothing had been stolen, but his mere presence felt like a threat. To most folks in Cedar Ridge, probably scouting for a raid, said Mrs. Patterson at the general store, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had survived 3 Indian scares. My late husband always said they never travel alone unless they're planning something. Melody bought the supplies Ruth had requested, listening to the conversations swirling around her. Fear had a particular sound in people's voices, sharp and brittle like thin ice. But underneath it, she heard something else, a kind of excitement, as if some folks were hoping for trouble to justify the anger they carried. Walking home with her basket, she noticed the changes that had already begun. Fewer children played in the streets. Windows stayed shuttered longer during the day. Men wore their guns more prominently, hands resting on their holsters, even during casual conversations. That afternoon, as Melody sat on the porch despite Ruth's protests, she saw him for the first time. He rode into town alone just as the rumors had described, but seeing him in person was different from all the fearful whispers. Apache was a man in his 50s, his dark hair streaked with silver and pulled back in a traditional style. He sat his horse with the easy grace of someone who had been riding since childhood, his weathered hands steady on the reins. He wore a mixture of traditional and traded clothing, buckskin pants and moccasins, but also a cotton shirt and a leather vest that had clearly seen many years of use. A medicine pouch hung from his belt, and Melody could see the carved handle of a knife, but he carried no rifle, no obvious weapons beyond what any man might need for hunting or protection. What struck her most was his face. The townspeople saw an enemy, a threat to their safety and way of life. But Melody saw something different, a weariness that reminded her of her own, the look of someone who had lost more than he cared to remember. Apache guided his horse slowly down Main Street, his dark eyes taking in everything without apparent alarm. He nodded politely to people he passed, though most turned away or crossed to the other side of the street. Children were hurried inside, doors slammed shut, and within minutes the street had nearly emptied. He stopped at the trading post, dismounted, and tied his horse to the hitching rail with movements that were both careful and confident. Whatever had brought him to Cedar Ridge. He wasn't planning to leave in a hurry. Sheriff Coleman appeared almost immediately, his hand resting on his gun. "State your business," he called out, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. Apache turned slowly, his expression calm but alert. "Trading business," he replied in accented but clear English. "Same as always. Things are different now," Coleman said, moving closer. "A lot of folks are nervous about Apache in town, especially alone. I come in peace, as I always have," Apache said simply. "To trade, not to fight." From her porch, Melody watched this exchange with growing fascination. She had expected an Apache warrior to be fierce and frightening, the kind of savage described in the stories adults told to make children behave. But this man seemed more sad than savage, more tired than threatening. The trading post owner, a nervous man named Briggs, emerged from his store. "What do you need?" he asked quickly, clearly wanting to complete any transaction and send Apache on his way. "Supplies for winter, coffee, sugar, blankets," Apache replied. "I have furs to trade." The negotiation that followed was brief and tense, conducted under the watchful eyes of half the town. Apache produced beautiful pelts from his saddlebags, fox, rabbit, and deer hides that were clearly the work of a skilled hunter. But Briggs barely looked at them, offering prices that were obviously unfair. Apache accepted the poor terms without argument, taking his meager supplies and preparing to leave. As he loaded his saddlebags, a group of children appeared from behind the schoolhouse, apparently having escaped their mother's watchful eyes. "Indian! Indian!" one of them shouted, and suddenly they were throwing rocks and dirt clods, their young voices shrill with excitement and fear. Most of the stones missed their target, but one struck Apache in the shoulder. He didn't react with anger or violence, as Melody expected. Instead, he simply stood still, his hands at his sides, letting the barrage continue until the sheriff finally intervened. "That's enough!" Coleman barked at the children. "Get on home before I tell your parents." The children scattered, laughing and breathless from their adventure. But Melody remained on her porch, watching Ashki's face as he brushed dust from his shirt. In that moment, she recognized something she had been feeling for months, the particular loneliness of being unwanted, of being seen as a problem rather than a person. As Ashki mounted his horse, their eyes met across the distance of Main Street. Neither spoke, but something passed between them, a recognition of shared outsider status, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that they had both been watching each other when everyone else was either hiding or hostile. He rode away slowly, his back straight despite the humiliation he had endured. Melody remained on the porch long after he disappeared from view, thinking about the sadness in his eyes and the way he had accepted injustice without fighting back. That evening, as Ruth prepared supper, she noticed Melody's unusual quietness. "Something troubling you, dear?" "The Apache man who came to town today," Melody said carefully. "He didn't seem dangerous." Ruth's hands stilled in their work. "Melody, you mustn't think such things. Just because someone appears peaceful doesn't mean they are. Your mother made that mistake once, and—" She caught herself, pressing her lips together. "What mistake?" "Nothing, dear. Just remember that things aren't always what they seem." But later that night, as Melody lay in her bed listening to her Aunt and Uncle's whispered conversation, she heard Thomas saying something that made her heart race. "Have to send her away soon, Ruth. People are already talking about Catherine's daughter being here, and with tensions rising, she's just a child who's showing the same dangerous sympathies as her mother. Did you see her? Watching that Apache today, same look Catherine used to get." Melody pulled her blanket over her head, but couldn't block out the fear in their voices or the implications of their words. Tomorrow, she realized, might be her last day in Cedar Ridge. Tomorrow, she might be sent away to strangers who would try to make her forget everything her mother had ever taught her about seeing people's hearts instead of their differences. As she drifted towards sleep, Melody made a decision that would change everything. If this was to be her last day of freedom, she would use it to do something her mother would have been proud of, something that might honor the memory of a woman who had apparently believed that enemies could become friends, that mercy was stronger than fear. She would find the Apache warrior again, she would take his hand, and she would ask him to follow her home. Dawn came too early to Cedar Ridge, bringing with it the kind of crystalline light that made every detail sharp and unforgiving. Melody woke to the sound of Ruth packing, a careful, methodical rustling that spoke of decisions already made and futures already decided. "Best to get an early start," Thomas was saying from the kitchen, his voice carrying the artificial cheerfulness adults used when they wanted to convince themselves they were doing the right thing. "Coach leaves for Santa Fe at noon. Give you time to settle in before evening." Melody lay still, watching dust motes dance in the morning sunbeams slanting through the window. Her small carpet bag sat by the door, packed with everything she owned in the world. 2 dresses, a hairbrush that had been her mother's, and a worn wooden cross that Ruth claimed had no particular significance. But Melody remembered differently. She remembered her mother holding that cross, running her fingers over its smooth surface while she told stories about kindness and courage, about people who chose mercy over fear even when it cost them everything. "Melody, dear, time to get dressed," Ruth called softly. "We'll have breakfast. Then Thomas will walk you to the coach." The finality in her aunt's voice settled over Melody like a heavy quilt. This was really happening. In a few hours, she would be on a dusty coach heading toward Santa Fe and a life among strangers who would try to teach her to be someone her mother wouldn't recognize. She dressed slowly, each button and tie feeling like another small surrender. The blue dress Ruth had given her was practical and proper, the kind of clothing that wouldn't draw attention or invite gossip. Safe clothing for a safe life that stretched ahead of her like a long, empty road. Breakfast passed in careful conversation about the weather and her journey, everyone avoiding the larger questions that hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. Would she be happy? Would she remember them? Would she grow up to be the kind of woman who kept her sympathies to herself and her questions unasked? "The sisters at the orphanage are good women," Ruth said, buttering bread with mechanical precision. "They'll teach you useful skills, help. You become a proper young lady." "What if I don't want to be proper?" Melody asked quietly. Thomas set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink. "Melody, propriety isn't a choice for young women. It's a necessity. Your mother never learned that lesson, and you see what happened to her." "What did happen to her?" Melody pressed, something inside her refusing to accept the careful silence any longer. "Really?" The look that passed between Ruth and Thomas was heavy with shared secrets. Finally, Ruth reached across the table and took Melody's small hand in both of hers. "Your mother had a good heart, dear. Too good, perhaps. She believed that kindness could bridge any gap, heal any wound. But some wounds are too deep, some gaps too wide. She tried to help where help wasn't wanted, tried to make peace where peace wasn't possible." "With the Apache?" Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "That's enough questions for one morning. Ruth, get her ready. I'll be back shortly to walk her to the coach." After he left, Ruth continued packing Melody's few belongings with hands that trembled slightly. "Your mother saved someone once," she said without looking up. "An Apache man who was wounded, hiding near our old farm. She tended his injuries, gave him food and shelter when any sensible person would have turned him away." Melody's heart quickened. "What happened to him?" "He lived, got better and left. But people found out what Catherine had done, and, well, people in these parts don't forgive that kind of thing easily. Is that why we moved to town? Why, Papa, your father stood by your mother's choice, even when it cost him everything. They lost the farm, lost their standing in the community. Thomas took us in because we're family, but even he has his limits." Ruth finally looked up, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "The wagon accident wasn't just bad luck, Melody. Your parents were traveling at night, trying to avoid the main roads. They were running from something or someone. The wagon overturned on a rocky trail they never should have been traveling." The truth hit Melody like cold water. Her parents hadn't died in some random accident. They had died because her mother chose mercy over safety, compassion over common sense. And now the townspeople looked at Melody and saw Catherine McKenna's daughter, wondering if the same dangerous kindness might be growing in her young heart. The sound of men gathering outside interrupted Ruth's confession. Voices carried through. The morning air, urgent and angry, spotted him again just after sunrise, bold as brass, riding right past the Henderson place. Time to do something about this situation. Ruth moved to the window, her face pale. "Oh no, not today." Melody joined her aunt at the window, peering out at the growing crowd in the street. Men carried rifles and wore the grim expressions of people who had talked themselves into violence. At the center of the group stood Sheriff Coleman, trying to maintain some semblance of order while tension crackled around him like lightning before a storm. "What do they want?" Melody asked. "They want to solve the Apache problem once and for all," Ruth said quietly. "And they've decided that Apache man from yesterday is where they'll start." Thomas returned at that moment, his face flushed with exertion and excitement. "Change of plans," he announced. "Coach won't be running today. All this trouble with the Indian has folks stirred up. Might be better to wait until things settle down." But Melody barely heard him. Through the window, she could see a solitary figure riding slowly down Main Street. The same Apache warrior from yesterday, apparently unaware of the storm gathering around him. Ashkey rode with the same calm dignity he had shown before, his weathered hand steady on the reins. But this time was different. This time the men waiting for him carried more than harsh words and unfair prices. "Someone should warn him," Melody said. "Warn him?" Thomas's voice sharpened. "Melody, that man is the problem. He's been scouting our defenses, checking for weaknesses. Today the men of this town are going to make it clear that such behavior won't be tolerated." "But he's just one man," Melody protested, "and he hasn't hurt anyone." Yet, Thomas said grimly. The key word is yet. Melody watched as Ashki approached the crowd, his horse moving at the same measured pace despite the obvious danger. She could see his face clearly now, alert but unafraid, sad but determined. Whatever had brought him back to Cedar Ridge despite yesterday's hostility, it was important enough to risk his life for. The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal. The men surrounded Ashki before he could react, shouting accusations and demands. Someone grabbed his horse's bridle, while others pointed rifles at his chest. "State your business, Indian," Coleman shouted. "And it better be good." Ashki's voice carried clearly across the morning air. "I come seeking the McKenna family. There is something I must return to them." A murmur ran through the crowd at the mention of that name. Melody felt Ruth's hand tighten on her shoulder. "The McKennas are dead," someone called out. "Died in a wagon accident last year. The woman, Catherine McKenna, she is truly dead." The sadness in Ashki's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't the tone of an enemy seeking intelligence or planning raids. This was the voice of someone who had lost something precious and was only now learning the full extent of his loss. "Dead and buried," Thomas called out, having joined the crowd. "What business did you have with her?" Ashki was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes scanning the faces around him. "She saved my life once. I came to honor that debt." The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the gathered men. Some had suspected Catherine's involvement with the Apache, but hearing it confirmed by one of them was different, more real, more threatening. "You're the one," someone said. "The Indian she helped." "I am," Ashki replied simply. "And now I learn she is dead because of that kindness." The crowd's mood darkened further. Several men raised their rifles, and Melody could see the situation spiraling toward violence. "Please," she whispered to Ruth, "someone has to stop this." "It's not our place," Ruth said, but her voice lacked conviction. "These men know what they're doing." But Melody could see that they didn't. They knew only fear and anger, not the whole truth about her mother or the man they were about to harm. She thought about the wooden cross in her carpet bag, about her mother's stories of kindness and courage, about choices that cost everything but saved someone's soul. Without fully realizing what she was doing, Melody pulled away from Ruth's restraining hand and headed for the door. "Melody, no!" Ruth called after her. "Come back!" But Melody was already running, her feet carrying her toward the crowd of angry men and the lone Apache warrior who had come to honor a debt to her dead mother. She pushed through the crowd, her small size allowing her to slip between the men before anyone could stop her. She emerged into the circle they had formed around Ashki, her blue dress bright against the dusty street. "Don't hurt him," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Please don't hurt him." The crowd stared in shock as this 7-year-old girl stepped between them and their target. Someone cursed under his breath. Others began calling for Thomas to come get his niece before she got herself hurt. But Melody ignored them all. She walked straight up to Ashki's horse, looked up at the weathered Apache warrior who had risked everything to honor her mother's memory, and did the only thing that made sense in a world gone mad with fear. She reached up and took his hand. "Follow me home," she said softly. The words fell into the morning air like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread outward through the crowd and beyond. This was the moment everything changed, when a child's courage met a warrior's honor, when mercy triumphed over fear, when the daughter of Catherine McKenna chose to continue her mother's legacy of dangerous kindness. Ashki looked down at the small girl holding his hand, seeing in her face an echo of the woman who had saved his life years ago. Without a word, he dismounted and stood beside her, his weathered hand gentle in her small grasp. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Melody began walking toward the edge of town, leading the Apache warrior away from danger and toward a truth that neither the townspeople nor Ashki himself could yet imagine. The walk to the old McKenna farm took place in silence that felt both sacred and dangerous. Behind them, Melody could hear the murmur of voices as the crowd debated what to do about this unprecedented situation. Some called for immediate action, others urged caution. Sheriff Coleman's voice rose above the rest, trying to maintain order while figuring out how to handle a 7-year-old girl leading an Apache warrior out of town. But Melody paid them no attention. Her small hand remained clasped in Ashke's weathered one as she guided him along the dusty path that led away from Cedar Ridge toward the abandoned homestead where her family had once lived. The warrior's horse followed behind them, reins loose, as if sensing the gravity of this moment. "You are Catherine's daughter," Ashke said finally, his accented English carrying a note of wonder. "You have her eyes. You knew my mama?" Melody asked, though she already knew the answer. "I knew her," he replied simply. "She was—" He paused, searching for the right words. "She was light in darkness. When the world showed only hatred, she showed mercy." They crested a small hill, and there before them lay the McKenna farmstead. The house still stood, though its windows were dark and empty. The barn leaned at a precarious angle, its roof partially collapsed from the weight of too many harsh winters. Weeds had overtaken the vegetable garden Catherine had once tended with such care, but for all its decay, the place held an undeniable sense of peace. Cottonwood trees lined the creek that ran behind the house, their leaves whispering secrets to the morning breeze. The mountains rose in the distance, purple and majestic against the clear sky. "This is where it happened," Melody said, leading Ashke toward the house. "Where you met my mama." Ashke stopped walking, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape. 15 winters ago," he murmured. "I was young then, angry. The white soldiers had burned our winter camp, killed our elders. I was leading raids against the settlers, seeking revenge for blood that could never be repaid." Melody listened without fear as this Apache warrior described a past filled with violence. She sensed something in his voice, not pride in those old battles, but sorrow for the pain they had caused. "I was wounded," Ashke continued, his free hand moving unconsciously to his left shoulder. "Shot by soldiers near the river. I found this place by accident, looking for somewhere to hide until I healed or died." They had reached the front porch now, its wooden boards gray with age and weather. Melody climbed the steps, still holding Ashke's hand, and pushed open the door that hung crooked on its hinges. The inside of the house felt like a tomb, heavy with dust and memories. Furniture remained where Catherine had left it, a rocking chair by the fireplace, a kitchen table, scarred by years of use, shelves that had once held books and precious things. "She found me in the barn," Ashke said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Bleeding, fevered, close to death. Any reasonable person would have shot me or called for help. Instead, she brought me water." Melody moved through the main room, her fingers trailing over surfaces that still held traces of her mother's presence. On the mantelpiece, she found what she was looking for, a small wooden box that Catherine had always kept locked. "She told me her name," Ashke continued, lost in the memory. "Catherine, it means pure in your language," she said. "I told her mine, Ashke, which means boy in Apache. She laughed and said I was too old to be called boy, but the name suited me anyway." The wooden box opened easily in Melody's hands, its simple latch long since broken. Inside, wrapped in faded blue cloth, lay a collection of items that made her heart race: feathers, beads, and a small carved figure of a horse. "She kept these," Melody said, holding up the Apache artifacts. "She kept your things." Ashke's eyes widened as he recognized items he had made during his recovery. The carved horse had been whittled during long hours when infection and fever had left him weak as a child. The beads were from a necklace his grandmother had made, given to Catherine as payment for her kindness. "I thought she would throw them away," he said, "or burn them when I left." "Mama never threw away anything that represented kindness," Melody replied, her young voice carrying wisdom beyond her years. "She said that every act of mercy was sacred, no matter who it came from." Footsteps on the porch interrupted their conversation. Through the dirty windows, they could see Sheriff Coleman approaching with Thomas McKenna and two other men from town. All four carried rifles and wore expressions of grim determination. "Time to end this foolishness," Coleman called out. "Melody, come away from there right now." But Melody moved closer to Ashkey instead of toward the door. "They don't understand," she said quietly. "They think you're dangerous." "I was dangerous once," Ashkey replied. "Your mother helped me become something else." Thomas climbed the porch steps, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. "Melody, you've caused enough trouble for one day. Come here immediately." "No," Melody said, the word carrying surprising force for such a small voice. "Not until you listen." "Listen to what? The ravings of a savage who's filled your head with lies about your mother?" Ashkey stepped forward, placing himself between Melody and her uncle. "I speak no lies about Catherine McKenna. She saved my life, asked nothing in return. When I was healed, she sent me away with medicine for my people and a message of peace." "Peace?" One of the other men spat. "That why you've been scouting our town, planning another raid?" "I came seeking news of Catherine," Ashkey said calmly, "to repay a debt of honor. In my culture, such debts pass to the next generation if left unpaid." Coleman raised his rifle. "Well, she's dead, so consider your debt settled. Now, move away from the girl." "Wait," Melody said, stepping out from behind Ashkey. "Uncle Thomas, there's something else, something about Mama you need to know." She moved to the kitchen, where a loose floorboard had always creaked under her mother's step. Working her small fingers under the edge, she pried it up to reveal a hiding space beneath. Inside lay a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, along with a small cloth doll that had clearly been made by Apache hands but dressed in settler clothes. The doll's face was painted with gentle features, and its clothing showed the careful stitching of someone who had learned both cultures' ways of making beautiful things. "She never stopped writing to them," Melody said, holding up the letters. "To the Apache women. They taught her how to make medicines, how to prepare food that would keep through harsh winters. She taught them how to read English, how to speak with the government men." Thomas stepped forward, his face pale. "That's impossible. Catherine never—" "She did," Melody interrupted. "She met with them in secret, helped them trade safely, gave them warnings when the soldiers were coming. She believed that if women could become friends, maybe the men would stop fighting." Ashkey took the cloth doll from Melody's hands, his weathered fingers tracing its carefully crafted features. "This was made by my sister," he said, wonder in his voice, "for Catherine's baby. For you." The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a sacred fire. This child, this unwanted orphan who reminded everyone of her mother's dangerous sympathies, had been loved and celebrated by Apache women who saw beyond the divisions that kept their peoples apart. The women never stopped asking about Catherine, Ashkey continued. When she stopped coming to our meetings, they feared something had happened. They sent me to find her, to bring her news of the children she had helped educate. Sheriff Coleman lowered his rifle slightly, confusion replacing certainty on his weathered face. "You're saying Catherine McKenna was working with Apache women, teaching them to read?" "Teaching and learning," Ashkey confirmed. "She believed education could build bridges where treaties had failed. The women trusted her because she kept her word, never betrayed their secrets to the soldiers or government agents." Thomas sank into Catherine's old rocking chair, the weight of these revelations crushing his certainty about his sister-in-law's character. If this is true, then why did she leave? Why did she and William abandon the farm? Melody held up one of the letters, its paper yellowed with age. "Because someone found out. Someone threatened to hurt the Apache families if she didn't stop." The meetings. The truth hung heavy in the dusty air of the abandoned farmhouse. Catherine McKenna hadn't been a foolish woman endangering her family through misguided sympathy. She had been a bridge builder, a peacemaker, someone who saw past the surface divisions to the shared humanity underneath. "She died protecting them," Melody said quietly. "Protecting you," she added, looking directly at Ashkey. The wagon accident happened because she and Papa were traveling at night, trying to lead the danger away from the Apache families. Ashki closed his eyes, his weathered face etched with pain and gratitude in equal measure. She saved me twice then, once with medicine for my body, once with sacrifice for my people. Sheriff Coleman holstered his weapon, the fight gone out of him. Even if all this is true, what does it change? The girl still needs proper care, and tensions in town are still running high. It changes everything, Melody said, moving to stand beside Ashki. It means my mama wasn't wrong to show kindness. It means the work she started doesn't have to die with her. The four men exchanged glances, each grappling with the implications of what they had learned. Thomas looked at his niece with new eyes, seeing Catherine's determination and wisdom shining through the child's small frame. "What are you proposing, Melody?" he asked quietly. "I'm proposing we finish what she started," Melody replied. "I'm proposing we choose courage over fear, just like she did." The silence that followed Melody's declaration stretched long enough for dust motes to settle, and the morning sun to shift perceptibly across the weathered floorboards. Thomas McKenna stared at his 7-year-old niece as if seeing a stranger, while Sheriff Coleman shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. "Melody," Thomas said finally, his voice careful and measured, "you're just a child. You don't understand the complexities of these situations." "I understand that people are afraid," Melody replied, her small chin lifted with Catherine's stubborn determination. "And I understand that fear makes people do terrible things to each other." Ashki moved to the window, gazing out at the creek where cottonwood leaves danced in the breeze. "The child speaks wisdom," he said quietly. "Fear has been our master too long, Apache and white settler alike." From his position by the window, Ashki could see riders approaching in the distance. "More men come," he announced, his hand moving instinctively toward the knife at his belt. Sheriff Coleman peered out, cursing under his breath. "That's Mayor Hutchins, with half the town council, and they don't look like they're coming to talk." Thomas moved to another window, his face pale. "They're armed for trouble. Someone must have told them about Melody leading you here." The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, along with the angry voices of men who had worked themselves into a righteous fury. Melody recognized the particular quality of that anger, the kind that fed on itself until it became something dangerous and unstoppable. "You have to hide," she told Ashki urgently. "They won't listen to reason when they're like this." But Ashki shook his head. "I'm tired of hiding, little one. Tired of running from fear and hatred. Your mother didn't hide from the truth, and neither will I." "Then you'll die," Thomas said bluntly, "and probably get Melody killed in the process." Is that what Catherine would have wanted? The question hit Ashki like a physical blow. He looked down at Melody, seeing Catherine's courage shining in her young eyes, and felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. "There's another." "Way!" Melody said suddenly. "The barn. Mama showed me once. There's a hiding place in the loft. You could stay there while we talk to them." "Melody," Thomas began. "No, Uncle Thomas, this is important. Ashki came here to honor a debt to my mama. The least we can do is keep him alive long enough to understand what that means." The riders were close now, their angry voices carrying across the prairie. Ashki looked from Melody to Thomas, weighing his options. Running would solve nothing. They would only hunt him down. Fighting would end in bloodshed that would stain this sacred place where Catherine had chosen mercy over. "Vengeance. Show me," he said to Melody. They moved quickly to the barn, where a ladder led to the loft that had once stored hay for winter feeding. Hidden behind a false wall, Catherine had created a small space that could shelter someone in need of hiding. Ashki fitted into it easily, his weathered face grim but determined. "No matter what they say," Melody whispered to him, "remember that my mama believed in peace. She believed that enemies could become friends if someone was brave enough to take the first step." "And you?" Ashki asked. "What do you believe?" Melody touched the faded blue ribbon she had found in the barn beam, feeling its soft texture between her fingers. I believe in finishing what she started. I believe in keeping promises, even when it's dangerous. The sound of horses in the farmyard cut short their conversation. Melody climbed down from the loft, brushing hay from her dress, and walked out. To face the approaching storm, Mayor Hutchins led the group, a portly man with a grey beard and the kind of authority that came from owning the largest store in town. Behind him rode 6 other men, all armed and wearing expressions of grim determination. "Thomas McKenna," Hutchins called out as he dismounted. "What in blazes do you think you're doing out here?" "Trying to understand the truth," Thomas replied, stepping protectively in front of Melody. "About my sister-in-law and this Apache man." "The truth?" Hutchins spat. "The truth is that your niece led a dangerous savage away from town, putting every man, woman, and child at risk. Where is he?" Sheriff Coleman stepped forward. "He's gone, Mayor, headed back toward the reservation once he realized the trouble he'd caused." Melody started to protest, but Thomas's warning hand on her shoulder kept her silent. She understood. Sometimes protecting someone meant lying to those who would do them harm. "Gone where?" demanded one of the other men. "We tracked. His horse here? Horse ran off when the shooting started," Coleman said smoothly. "Indian took off on foot toward the mountains. Be halfway to the territorial border by now." It was a believable lie, and Melody could see some of the tension leave the men's shoulders. They had come prepared for a fight, but without a target. For their anger, the energy began to dissipate. "What about her?" Hutchins pointed at Melody with his riding crop. "Girl who consorts with savages needs to be taught proper behavior." "She's 7 years old," Thomas said, his voice carrying a warning edge, "and she's my responsibility." "Your responsibility that nearly got our town raided," another man spoke up. "Maybe it's time someone else took charge of Catherine McKenna's daughter." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Melody felt the familiar fear creeping up her spine, the knowledge that she was unwanted, unwelcome, a reminder of choices that good people didn't make. But then she thought about the letters hidden in the farmhouse, about Apache women who had asked after Catherine's welfare, about bridges built in secret between women who refused to let their men's hatred define their children's future. "I want to stay here," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through the men's angry muttering. "What?" Thomas looked down at her in surprise. "I want to stay at the farm, fix it up, make it a home again. It's where I belong." Mayor Hutchins laughed, a harsh sound that carried no humor. "Child, this place has been abandoned for over a year. No one's going to let a 7-year-old girl live alone in Apache territory." "She wouldn't be alone," Thomas said slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Ruth and I could move out here, work the land again. Might be good to get away from town gossip." It was an impulsive offer, one that surprised Thomas himself as much as the others. But as he looked around the farmstead where Catherine had tried to build something better than hatred, he felt the pull of unfinished business. "You're talking nonsense," Hutchins declared. "This farm is too close to the reservation, too dangerous for decent families." "Dangerous why?" Melody asked innocently. "Because Apache people live nearby. Or because we might learn they're not the monsters we've been told they are." The question struck like lightning in the charged air. Several of the men shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to examine their assumptions too closely. Sheriff Coleman cleared his throat. "Mayor, perhaps we should return to town. Let the McKenna family work out their own arrangements." "And leave them here to cause more trouble?" Hutchins protested. "What trouble?" Thomas asked, his own anger finally surfacing. "A little girl learning the truth about her mother? A family trying to make an honest living on their own land?" The confrontation might have escalated further, but the sound of approaching riders interrupted the argument. This time, however, the newcomers wore the blue uniforms of territorial soldiers. Captain Morrison, the local military commander, rode up with a small patrol, his weathered face grim with official business. "Gentlemen," he said, dismounting with military precision, "I understand there's been some trouble with Apache in the area. The arrival of federal authority changed the entire dynamic." The local men suddenly looked less certain of their positions, while Thomas and Sheriff Coleman exchanged worried glances. "No trouble here, Captain," Coleman said carefully. "Just a misunderstanding that's been resolved." Morrison's experienced eyes took in the scene. The armed civilians, the abandoned farmhouse, the young girl standing protectively close to her uncle. "I see. And this misunderstanding involved Apache warriors threatening local settlers." "Not threatening," Melody said. "Before anyone could stop her. Helping. The Apache man came to help, just like my mama helped them." Captain Morrison's gaze sharpened with interest. "Your mother helped Apache? How so, young lady?" And with that question, Melody realized she had opened a door that could never be closed again. The truth about Catherine McKenna was about to become public knowledge, with consequences none of them could predict. Captain Morrison's question hung in the morning air like a challenge that demanded an answer. Melody felt every adult eye upon her, some pleading for silence, others burning with curiosity. The weight of her mother's secret pressed against her, chest like a stone. But she thought about Catherine's courage and made her choice. "She taught Apache women to read English," Melody said, her young voice carrying across the farmyard with startling clarity. "And they taught her about medicines and survival. They met in secret because people on both sides were afraid of friendship." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Mayor Hutchins cursed under his breath, while several of his men began talking at once. Thomas McKenna's face went pale as he realized his niece had just revealed information that could reshape everything the military understood about local Apache relations. Captain Morrison raised his hand for silence, his trained mind already working through the implications. "These meetings, when did they take place?" "For 2 years before we moved to town," Melody replied. "Every month, sometimes more often. The women would come here at night, and Mama would have lanterns lit to guide them safely." "Melody," Thomas said urgently, "perhaps you shouldn't." "No, Uncle Thomas. Mama said that truth was like sunlight. It might hurt your eyes at first, but it helped things grow." Morrison dismounted and approached the farmhouse, his military bearings softened by genuine curiosity. "Young lady, what you're describing sounds like unauthorized communication with enemy forces. That's a serious federal offense." "Enemy?" Melody's voice carried a note of confusion that cut through the tension. "How can teachers and mothers be enemies? How can people who share medicine and food and stories about their children be enemies?" The simplicity of her question exposed the complexity of adult fears and prejudices. Morrison found himself struggling to explain military doctrine to a child who had seen a different reality. "The Apache have been fighting settlers and soldiers for years," he said carefully. "Many people have died on both sides." "I know," Melody said sadly. "Mama cried about it sometimes. She said the fighting happened because men forgot that their enemies had children who needed food and medicine just like ours do." From the barn, though no one could see him, Ashki listened to this young girl defending her mother's vision of peace. His heart ached with the recognition that Catherine's daughter possessed the same dangerous courage that had ultimately cost Catherine her life. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, sensing an opportunity to defuse the situation. "Captain, the McKenna woman is dead, killed in a wagon accident over a year ago. Whatever communication existed between her and the Apache ended when she died." "Did it?" Morrison asked pointedly. "If there was an established relationship, other Apache might continue seeking contact." The question struck too close to the truth. Melody felt her cheeks burn as she realized how her words might endanger Ashki, hidden in the barn loft. Mayor Hutchins seized the moment. "That's exactly what we've been trying to tell you, Captain. This farm is a magnet for Apache activity. The girls already demonstrated dangerous sympathies by approaching one of them yesterday. She approached an Apache warrior." Morrison's attention sharpened. "Where is this individual now?" "Gone," Thomas said quickly, frightened off when he realized he wasn't welcome. Morrison's experienced eyes studied the faces around him, noting the nervous glances and careful words. Something about this situation didn't match the simple story they were trying to tell. "I'd like to examine the farmhouse," he announced. "If this location was used for unauthorized contact with Apache forces, there might be evidence that could help us understand their current intentions." Melody's heart raced. The letters, the artifacts, the hiding place where Ashki waited, all of it would be discovered if Morrison conducted a thorough search. "Captain," she said, stepping forward, with the kind of courage that only children and saints possessed, "what if I told you that the Apache don't want to fight anymore?" "I'd say you're a brave little girl with a big imagination," Morrison replied gently. "What if I told you that some of their leaders want to make real peace, not just temporary truces that get broken when someone gets scared or angry?" Morrison knelt down to Melody's eye level, his weathered face serious. "Then I'd say that's information the territorial government would very much like to hear about." The admission changed everything. Suddenly, the adults realized that this conversation had moved beyond local gossip and threats into the realm of official policy and federal investigation. Thomas stepped protectively closer to his niece. "Melody, I think you've said enough for one day." "Have I?" she asked, looking up at him with Catherine's steady gaze. "Or maybe I haven't said nearly enough." From the barn came the faintest sound, a horse shifting restlessly, a board creaking under someone's weight. Morrison's head turned toward the noise, his military training making him alert to every detail. "That your horse, Mayor?" he asked Hutchins. "Our horses are all tied in front," Hutchins replied, suddenly nervous. Morrison drew his sidearm and began walking toward the barn. "Sheriff, I think we need to conduct a more thorough search of this property." Melody felt the moment slipping away from her, felt the careful balance she had been trying to maintain crumbling, like a house built on sand. In desperation, she played her last card. "Captain Morrison," she called out, her voice carrying the authority of absolute truth. "If I show you proof that my mama was working for peace, will you promise not to hurt anyone who was helping her?" Morrison paused, his hand on the barn door. "What kind of proof?" Melody ran back into the farmhouse, ignoring Thomas's protests, and retrieved the bundle of letters from their hiding place. She returned to the farmyard with the correspondence that documented months of careful negotiation between Catherine and Apache women. "These are letters," she said, holding out the bundle, "from Apache women who wanted their children to learn English so they could talk to government men without interpreters who might lie or make mistakes." Morrison holstered his weapon and took the letters, his eyes scanning the careful handwriting. That mixed English words with Apache phrases, even a quick reading, revealed the depth of trust and cooperation that had existed between Catherine and her Apache contacts. "My God," he murmured. "These discuss territorial boundaries, water rights, winter food distribution. This is diplomatic correspondence. Is it illegal?" Melody asked, though she already feared the answer. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, weighing military regulations against the evidence of genuine peacemaking efforts. "Technically, yes. Civilians aren't authorized to conduct negotiations with hostile forces." "But they weren't hostile," Melody protested. "That's the whole point. They were trying to find ways to avoid hostility." "The law doesn't always account for good intentions," Morrison said sadly. Mayor Hutchins moved closer, sensing victory. "So you'll arrest anyone involved in this treasonous activity?" "I'll follow the evidence wherever it leads," Morrison replied, carefully, "including to anyone who might currently be continuing these unauthorized communications." The barn door creaked in the breeze, and Morrison's attention returned to the structure that had drawn his suspicion. "I think it's time we examined that building thoroughly." Melody watched helplessly as the captain approached the barn, knowing that in moments Ashki would be discovered, and her attempt to honor her mother's legacy would end in violence and recrimination. But sometimes, when courage fails and truth seems insufficient, wisdom appears from unexpected sources. The sound of approaching riders interrupted Morrison's advance toward the barn. This time, however, the newcomers flew a white flag of truce, and at their head rode an elderly Apache woman whose bearing commanded instant respect. "I am Bidzee," she called out in accented but clear English. "I come seeking Catherine McKenna to honor her memory and claim her daughter." The appearance of Bidzee and her small party of Apache women created a moment of profound silence that seemed to stretch across the prairie like the shadow of a great bird. Captain Morrison's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, then stopped, as he processed the white flag and the peaceful bearing of the approaching riders. Bidzee was a woman of perhaps 60 years, her silver-streaked hair braided with traditional ornaments that caught the morning light. She rode with the dignity of someone accustomed to leadership, her weathered hands steady on the reins despite the obvious tension of the situation. Behind her rode 3 younger women, all carrying themselves with the same quiet strength. They wore a mixture of traditional and traded clothing, buckskin dresses adorned with beadwork, but also cotton shirts and woolen blankets that spoke of contact with the wider world. "Captain Morrison," Bidzee said, addressing him directly, "I know of you. You are the soldier chief who keeps his word when he gives it." Morrison straightened, surprised to be recognized. "You know me? Catherine McKenna spoke of you often. She said you were a man who listened before he acted, who sought understanding before he reached for his gun." The revelation that Catherine had discussed military personnel with Apache leaders sent a ripple of unease through the gathered men. Mayor Hutchins stepped forward aggressively. "This is outrageous," he declared. "We're being invaded by savages, and you're standing here having a conversation." Bidzee's dark eyes fixed on Hutchins with the kind of steady gaze that made grown men uncomfortable. "I am Bidzee, grandmother to many, keeper of the old wisdom. I do not invade. I come in peace to fulfill a promise." "What promise?" Morrison asked, his military training warring with genuine curiosity. "Catherine McKenna asked me to care for her daughter if anything happened to her," Bidzee replied simply. "She knew the dangers she faced for choosing peace over hatred." Melody felt her heart stop. Her mother had made arrangements for her care, not with distant relatives or cold institutions, but with the Apache women who had become her friends and allies. Thomas stepped protectively in front of his niece. "Melody is my family. She stays with us." "Does she?" Bidzee asked gently. "The child looks thin, frightened. Her clothes are old, her spirit dimmed. Is this the life Catherine wanted for her daughter?" The accuracy of the observation stung because it was true. Melody had been surviving with Thomas and Ruth, not thriving. She had been tolerated rather than loved, endured rather than embraced. "You can't just take her," Sheriff Coleman said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I do not take," Bidzee corrected. "I offer. Catherine's daughter may choose her own path, as her mother did." Captain Morrison found himself in an impossible situation. Military protocol demanded he treat this as a potential hostile contact, but the letters in his hand suggested something far more complex than enemy aggression. "Mrs." he began, then stopped, unsure of proper address. "Bidzee is sufficient," she said with gentle humor. "I am not a white woman to be called Mrs. Bidzee, these communications with Catherine McKenna, were they authorized by your tribal leadership?" The Apache woman considered her answer carefully. "They were authorized by the leadership that matters most, the mothers who want their children to live in peace rather than die in war." One of the younger women with Bidzee spoke up, her English careful but clear. "I am Nasha. Catherine taught me to read, to write. My children know English words because of her kindness." "And I am Huyana," said another. "Catherine showed me how to prepare medicines your people use. Many Apache children lived through the fever sickness because of what she taught me." The testimony of these women painted a picture far different from the hostile savages that existed in most settlers' imaginations. These were mothers, teachers, healers, people concerned with the same daily struggles of survival and child-rearing that occupied every frontier family. This is all very touching, Mayor Hutchins said with obvious skepticism. But it doesn't change the fact that unauthorized communication with hostile forces is illegal. Hostile? Bidsey's voice carried a note of genuine puzzlement. Captain Morrison, do hostile forces send grandmothers with white flags to discuss the welfare of orphaned children? Morrison found himself caught between military regulations and human common sense. The evidence before him suggested that Catherine McKenna had been conducting informal diplomacy that might have prevented conflicts rather than caused them. The territorial government doesn't recognize unofficial peace negotiations, he said carefully. Perhaps, Bidsey replied, the territorial government should reconsider what it chooses to recognize. From the barn came another slight sound. A horse nickering softly. Bidsey's eyes flickered toward the structure, and Melody saw recognition pass across her weathered features. "Ashki," Bidsey called softly. "Come out, my grandson. The time for hiding is past." The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock among the assembled men. Morrison's hand moved toward his weapon as the barn door opened and the Apache warrior emerged, his weathered face resigned but unafraid. "Grandmother," Ashki said respectfully, though the relationship was clearly spiritual rather than blood. "I did not expect to see you here. I did not expect to find you hiding in a barn like a fox," Bidsey replied with dry humor. "But Catherine's daughter has grown brave like her mother, willing to risk much for the sake of understanding." Captain Morrison drew his sidearm, though he kept it pointed at the ground. "Sir, you're under arrest for unauthorized presence in territorial boundaries." "Wait," Melody said, stepping between Morrison and Ashki. "Please, Captain, let them explain why they're really here." "Child," Morrison said gently, "this is beyond your understanding." "Is it?" Melody asked, her voice carrying Catherine's stubborn courage. "Or is it exactly what I understand better than anyone else?" She turned to face the assembled group, soldiers, townsmen, and Apache women, all watching her with varying degrees of skepticism and hope. "My mama believed that people could choose peace over war if someone was brave enough to start the conversation," she said. "She believed that mothers from different peoples could find common ground in wanting their children to be safe and happy." The simplicity of her words cut through the complex web of fear and politics that had trapped them all. "Captain Morrison," she continued, "what if I told you that Bidsey and the other women have been trying to prevent raids, not plan them? What if I told you that some Apache leaders want to negotiate real peace, but they don't trust the government to keep its promises?" Morrison holstered his weapon, his experienced mind grappling with implications that could reshape territorial policy. "I'd say that's information that needs to reach the right people in Washington." "And what if I told you," Melody said, her young voice growing stronger with each word, "that the only thing standing between peace and war is whether we choose to see each other as enemies or as people?" The question hung in the air like a prayer, waiting for someone brave enough to answer it with action rather than words. Bidsey dismounted and walked slowly toward Melody, her weathered hands extended in greeting. "Catherine's daughter speaks. With her mother's wisdom," she said. "Perhaps it is time for all of us to listen." As the Apache grandmother and the 7-year-old girl embraced in the dusty farmyard, something shifted in the morning air, a sense that the old patterns of fear and hatred might finally be breaking down, replaced by something newer and more hopeful. The embrace between Bidsey and Melody seemed to suspend time itself, creating a moment of perfect understanding that transcended the complex web of fear and politics surrounding them. But as Captain Morrison watched this display of cross-cultural affection, his military mind was already working through the implications of what he had witnessed. "This changes everything," he said quietly, more to himself than to the others. Sheriff Coleman stepped forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "Captain, what exactly are you thinking?" Morrison looked around the assembled group, Apache women, angry townsmen, a frightened uncle, and one remarkably brave little girl. "I'm thinking that we may have stumbled onto something far more significant." than a simple border incident. He turned to Bidsey, his voice taking on the formal tone of official inquiry. You mentioned that Catherine McKenna spoke of me. What exactly did she say? Bidsey released Melody, but kept one weathered hand on the child's shoulder. She said you were different from other soldier chiefs, that you listened to Apache concerns about water rights and winter camps. She believed you might be willing to hear proposals for lasting peace. Proposals? Morrison's eyebrows raised. What kind of proposals? The kind that come from women who are tired of burying their children, Nasha said, stepping forward. The kind that speak of shared hunting grounds and trade agreements instead of warfare and revenge. Mayor Hutchins had been growing increasingly agitated during this exchange. Captain Morrison, surely you're not going to give credence to savage propaganda. Mayor! Morrison interrupted sharply. I suggest you let me determine what constitutes valuable intelligence. But even as he spoke, Morrison noticed something that made his soldiers' instincts prickle with unease. Throughout this entire confrontation, Mayor Hutchins had been positioning himself between the group and the road back to town, his hand resting on his gun in a way that suggested readiness for violence rather than mere caution. Bidsey, Morrison said carefully, these peace proposals, do they have support from Apache war leaders, or just from the women? From those who matter, she replied diplomatically, from those who have grown weary of a war that brings only suffering to our people. Ashki moved closer to his grandmother figure, his weathered face grave. Captain, there is something you should know. The raids that have frightened this area, they are not the work of our people. The statement hit the gathering like a lightning bolt. Several of the townsmen began talking at once, their voices rising with indignation and disbelief. That's impossible, Thomas said. We've seen the evidence. Apache arrows, Apache war paint, Apache arrows made by white hands, Ashki interrupted. Apache war paint, mixed by those who learned our symbols, but not our honor. Morrison felt a chill run down his spine as implications began falling into place. Are you saying these raids were staged? I am saying, Ashki replied with careful dignity, that true Apache warriors do not leave evidence of their passing. We do not paint symbols for our enemies to read. We do not abandon arrows that can be traced to specific makers. Bidsey nodded gravely. For months, our scouts have reported white men dressed as Apache, attacking isolated farms and travelers. Always they leave evidence pointing to our people. Always they strike when soldiers are too far away to respond quickly. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, reshaping everything the assembled men thought they knew about recent events. Why didn't you report this to military authorities? Morrison demanded. Would you have believed us? Bidsey asked simply. Would any white soldier have taken the word of Apache against the evidence of his own eyes? Morrison found himself unable to answer, knowing that she was right. The military had been operating on assumptions that now seemed dangerously flawed. Mayor Hutchins had been growing increasingly pale during this exchange. This is ridiculous, he said, his voice carrying a note of desperation. You're going to believe savage lies over the evidence of Christian witnesses. What witnesses? Morrison asked sharply, turning to face Hutchins directly. Who actually saw these Apache raids taking place? The mayor's face flushed red. Well, the survivors, of course. The people who escaped. Name them, Morrison demanded. Give me specific names and testimony. Hutchins stammered, clearly unprepared for such direct questioning. The Henderson family reported finding their cattle scattered and their fence cut, Sheriff Coleman interrupted, his own suspicions beginning to surface. They never claimed to see who did it. As the adults grappled with these revelations, Melody had been studying Mayor Hutchins with the observant eyes of a child who had learned to read adult deception. Something about his behavior reminded her of the careful lies her aunt and uncle told when they wanted to hide uncomfortable truths. Mayor Hutchins, she said suddenly, her young voice cutting through the heated discussion. How did you know to bring so many armed men to the farm today? The question seemed innocent enough, but it struck Hutchins like a physical blow. "What do you mean, child?" "Yesterday, when Ashki came to town, only a few people saw me take his hand. But this morning, you had half the town council ready for a fight. How did you know where we were going?" Captain Morrison's experienced eyes sharpened as he recognized the tactical implications of Melody's observation. "That's an excellent question, Mayor. How did you know to look for them here specifically?" Hutchins's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "Someone must have seen them leaving town, followed them." "Who?" Sheriff Coleman pressed. "I was the only one who followed them initially, and I didn't report back to anyone before the mayor's group arrived." The silence that followed was heavy with suspicion and dawning realization. Bidsey watched Hutchins with the steady gaze of someone who had learned to read enemies, while Ashki's hand moved instinctively toward his knife. "There's something else," Melody said, her voice growing stronger as pieces of a puzzle began fitting together in her young mind. "Mayor Hutchins, you said the Apache have been scouting our defenses, but how would you know what they were looking? For unless you knew what needed to be defended," the child's logic was devastating in its simplicity. Morrison drew his sidearm, though he kept it pointed at the ground. "Mayor, I think you need to answer some very direct questions." But Hutchins was no longer listening. His hand had moved to his gun, and his eyes held the desperate look of a cornered animal. "You're all fools," he snarled, "standing here listening to savage lies and the babbling of a child." "What lies?" Bidsey asked calmly. "What have we said that is not true?" "You want to make peace," Hutchins spat. "You want to negotiate and compromise and give them everything they want. But some of us understand that this land belongs to white settlers, not Stone Age savages who don't know how to use it properly." The mask had finally slipped, revealing the hatred and greed that lay beneath the mayor's public respectability. Morrison raised his weapon, trained it on Hutchins with steady hands. "Stand down, Mayor. You're under arrest pending investigation." But Hutchins was beyond rational thought now. "Investigation? You want to investigate how I've been protecting this town from Apache raids? How I've been doing what needed to be done when the military was too weak to act? By staging false raids," Morrison demanded. "By murdering innocent people and blaming it on the Apache? By making sure the railroad gets built through Cedar Ridge instead of around it?" Hutchins replied with vicious honesty. "By making sure the Apache get moved off land that white men can use properly." The full scope of the conspiracy began to emerge like a hidden cancer exposed to sunlight. Hutchins had been orchestrating false Apache raids to justify military action that would clear the territory for railroad development. "The railroad company," Thomas said, understanding dawning in his voice. "You've been working with the railroad company. Someone has to think about the future of this territory," Hutchins declared. "Someone has to make the hard choices that will bring civilization to this wilderness." Ashki stepped forward, his weathered face calm despite the rage that must have been burning in his heart. "And Catherine McKenna? What hard choice did she represent?" Hutchins's expression turned uglier. "She was a traitor to her own people, consorting with enemies, filling their heads with ideas about peaceful coexistence. She had to be stopped." The admission hit Melody like a physical blow. Her parents hadn't died in an accident. They had been murdered by a man who saw their peacemaking efforts as a threat to his plans for war and profit. "You killed them," she whispered, her young voice carrying more authority than any adult accusation. "You killed my mama and papa. I protected this community from dangerous influences," Hutchins replied coldly. "Sometimes that requires difficult decisions." The truth hung in the morning air like a death sentence, transforming what had seemed like a simple frontier dispute into something far darker and more complex. Captain Morrison found himself facing not just unauthorized contact with Apache forces, but evidence of a conspiracy that reached from local politics to railroad boardrooms to the territorial government itself. "Mayor Hutchins," he said formally, You're under arrest for conspiracy, murder, and treason against the United States government." But as Morrison spoke those words, he realized that Hutchins had been slowly backing toward his horse, using the conversation as cover for his movements. Now the mayor was close enough to mount and flee, and his desperation made him dangerous. To everyone present, "Stand down," Morrison commanded, raising his weapon. Instead, Hutchins drew his own gun and pointed it directly at Melody. "Nobody moves," he snarled, "or the child dies along with her treasonous parents." The sight of Mayor Hutchins pointing a gun at 7-year-old Melody created a moment of crystalline tension that seemed to freeze everyone in place. Captain Morrison's military training warred with the knowledge that any sudden movement might cost a child her life, while Thomas McKenna felt his heart stop as he watched his niece stare down the barrel of a madman's weapon. "Easy now, Mayor," Morrison said in the calm voice he had used to talk desperate men down from violence. "Put the gun down. We can work this out." "Work it out?" Hutchins laughed, the sound harsh and bitter in the morning air. "You want to work out how I've spent 2 years building a future for this territory, only to watch it destroyed by a child's naive questions." Bidsy remained perfectly still, but her dark eyes held the alert watchfulness of someone calculating distances and possibilities. Beside her, Ashkey's weathered hands hung loose at his sides, though Melody could see the tension in his shoulders that spoke of readiness for action. "You're talking about murder, Hutchins," Sheriff Coleman said, his own gun drawn but useless. "With Melody in the line of fire. Killing a child won't solve your problems, won't it?" Hutchins's eyes held the wild gleam of someone who had crossed too many lines to find his way back to sanity. "She's Catherine McKenna's daughter, the living symbol of everything that threatens our future here. Get rid of her, and the Apache lose their strongest connection to the white community." "I'm not a symbol," Melody said quietly, her young voice carrying the kind of courage that only comes from having nothing left to lose. "I'm just a little girl who misses her mama." "Your mama was a traitor," Hutchins snarled. "She filled Apache heads with ideas about peace and cooperation when what they needed was a firm hand and clear boundaries. She filled their heads with hope," Melody replied, stepping slightly closer, despite the gun pointed at her chest. "She showed them that white people could be kind, could be trusted, could be friends." "Friends?" Hutchins's voice cracked with hysteria. "With savages who scalp children and burn farms?" "Like the farms you burned?" Ashkey asked quietly. "Like the children you killed and blamed on my people?" The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire. Hutchins's face contorted with rage and desperation as he realized that his carefully constructed lies were crumbling around him. "Someone had to make the hard choices," he repeated, as if saying the words enough times would make them true. "Someone had to think about the bigger picture." Captain Morrison began moving slowly to his left, trying to get a clear shot at Hutchins without endangering Melody. But the mayor was too experienced with frontier violence to be caught off guard so easily. "Stay where you are, Captain," Hutchins warned, swinging his gun toward Morrison momentarily before returning it to Melody. "I've got nothing left to lose now, thanks to this child's meddling." "You lost it the moment you chose murder over understanding," Bidsy said, her weathered voice carrying the weight of earned wisdom. "Violence always destroys the one who embraces it, even when it seems to bring temporary victory." "Save your Apache philosophy for someone who cares," Hutchins spat. "I've heard enough pretty words about peace and cooperation to last a lifetime." But even as he spoke, the mayor was calculating his chances of escape. His horse stood 20 feet away, saddled and ready. If he could mount quickly enough, he might be able to ride for the territorial border and disappear into the wilderness that stretched between settlements. The problem was Melody. She stood between him and his horse, a living witness to his confession of conspiracy and murder. As long as she remained alive, his crimes would follow him wherever he tried to hide. "Here's what's going to happen," Hutchins announced, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he had used in countless town meetings. "I'm going to take the girl with me as insurance. Once I'm safely away from here, I'll let her go." "You're lying," Thomas said flatly. "You've already admitted to killing her parents. Why would you spare her now?" Hutchins's silence was answer. Enough. Everyone present understood that he had no intention of letting Melody live to testify against him. "There has to be another way," Morrison said, desperation creeping into his professional calm. "Name your terms, Hutchins. What do you want?" "I want my life back," Hutchins replied with bitter honesty. "I want the last 2 years of careful planning to mean something. I want the Apache moved off this land so decent Christian families can build something lasting here. Even if it means murdering a child, even if it means doing what should have been done years ago." The conversation had reached its inevitable conclusion. Hutchins had moved beyond rational negotiation into the territory of fanatic conviction. He genuinely believed that his vision of territorial development justified any amount of violence, any level of deception. Melody looked around at the adults who were trying to save her. Her Uncle Thomas, pale with fear. Captain Morrison, calculating military options. Sheriff Coleman, helpless with his weapon drawn, but useless. Even Bidsey and Ashke, for all their wisdom and experience, seemed powerless against the simple brutality of a gun pointed at a child's heart. But Melody had learned something in her 7 years of life that the adults seemed to have forgotten. She had learned that sometimes the smallest person in a situation held the most power simply because they were brave enough to act when others were paralyzed by fear. "Mayor Hutchins," she said, taking another small step toward him, "what if I came with you willingly?" "Melody, no!" Thomas cried out, but she held up her small hand to stop him. "What if I promised not to run away or cause trouble?" she continued, her eyes fixed on Hutchins's face. "Would you promise not to hurt these people who are just trying to help?" Hutchins studied her with the suspicious attention of someone who had learned not to trust even children. "Why would you do that?" "Because my mama taught me that sometimes one person has to sacrifice for others," Melody replied simply. "She sacrificed for Apache families. Maybe I need to sacrifice for mine." The offer created a moment of perfect stillness in which everyone present grappled with the moral complexity of a child, volunteering to die to save others. It was the kind of gesture that revealed the best and worst of human nature in the same instant. "Melody," Bidsey said softly, "your mother would not want such a sacrifice from you, wouldn't she?" Melody asked, still moving slowly toward Hutchins. "She taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about doing the right thing, even when you are afraid." Hutchins watched her approach with growing confusion. He had expected fear, tears, desperate pleas for mercy. Instead, he faced a child who seemed to understand the situation better than any of the adults present. "Stop there," he commanded when she was within arm's reach. "Don't come any closer." But Melody took one more step, bringing herself close enough to touch the gun that threatened her life. "Mayor Hutchins," she said quietly, "do you have children?" The question seemed to come from nowhere, catching him completely off guard. "What? Do you have children of your own?" That's not relevant to anything." "I think it is," Melody said gently, "because if you have children, then you know how much parents love them. You know how much my mama and papa loved me." Hutchins's hand began to tremble slightly, the gun wavering in his grip. "Your parents were traitors to their own people. My parents were people who chose love over fear," Melody corrected. "They chose to see Apache families as people with children who needed food and medicine and education, just like white children." "Doe!" Behind her, the adults watched in amazement as this 7-year-old girl began dismantling the mayor's justifications with the simple logic of a child who had never learned that enemies were supposed to remain enemies forever. "You've been so afraid of losing your way of life that you forgot what made it worth living," she continued. "You've been so worried about the future that you destroyed the present." "I protected this community," Hutchins insisted, but his voice lacked conviction now. "You murdered my parents." Melody said quietly. "You killed innocent people and blamed others for your crimes. You tried to start a war to make yourself rich." Each accusation hit like a physical blow, stripping away the last of Hutchins's self-justification. In the clear morning light, surrounded by witnesses to his confession, he could no longer hide from the truth of what he had become. "It wasn't supposed to happen this way," he said, and for the first time his voice carried a note of genuine anguish. The railroad development was supposed to benefit everyone. The Apache was supposed to be relocated peacefully. But when they chose peace over relocation, you chose murder over compromise, Melody said. "When my mama showed that white and Apache people could be friends, you decided friendship was too dangerous to allow." The gun in Hutchins's hand felt impossibly heavy now, weighted down by the knowledge that he had crossed lines from which there could be no return. He had told himself that he was protecting civilization, but standing here with a gun pointed at a brave child's heart, he could no longer pretend that he represented anything noble or worthwhile. "What happens now?" he asked, the question directed more to the universe than to any specific person. "Now," said Captain Morrison, slowly lowering his own weapon, "you make the choice that defines who you really are. You can continue down this path of violence and hatred, or you can choose something better." "Like what?" Hutchins laughed bitterly. "Like surrender? Like facing trial for everything I've done? Like proving that redemption is possible," Melody said quietly. "Like showing that even people who make terrible mistakes can choose to do the right thing in the end." The offer of redemption hung in the morning air like a prayer, waiting for someone brave enough to accept it. The moment stretched between heartbeats, between choices, between the man Mayor Hutchins had been and the man he might still become. His weathered face showed the internal struggle of someone confronting the full weight of his actions, while the gun in his hand trembled with the uncertainty of his resolve. "Redemption," he repeated, the word sounding foreign in his mouth. "You think there's redemption for someone who's done what I've done?" "I think," Melody said quietly, "that my mama would have believed so. She always said that as long as a person was breathing, they still had chances to choose love over fear." Behind Melody, the adults watched this extraordinary confrontation unfold with a mixture of hope and terror. Thomas McKenna felt his heart pounding as his niece stood within arm's reach of a man who had already confessed to murdering her parents. Yet something in the child's calm courage seemed to be reaching through Hutchins's desperation to touch whatever remained of his humanity. Captain Morrison kept his weapon ready but lowered, recognizing that any sudden movement might shatter the fragile connection Melody was building with the mayor. His military experience had taught him to recognize moments when violence could either escalate beyond control or transform into something entirely different. "Your mother," Hutchins said, his voice cracking slightly, "was everything I told myself I was fighting against. She made peace seem possible when I needed war to justify my actions." "She made peace seem possible because it was possible," Melody replied. "But you were so afraid of losing control that you chose to destroy what she was building rather than learn from it." Bidsey watched this exchange with the kind of attention she might give to a sacred ceremony. In her long life, she had seen many moments when the path of history balanced on the edge of individual choice. This felt like one of those moments when a child's wisdom might prove stronger than an adult's hatred. "The railroad money," Hutchins said suddenly, as if the words were being torn from his chest. "They promised enough to transform this entire territory. Schools, hospitals, real churches instead of temporary buildings. I convinced myself that I was sacrificing a few for the good of many." "But you weren't sacrificing yourself," Ashki observed quietly. "You were sacrificing others, my people, Catherine's family, anyone who stood in the way of your vision." Hutchins turned toward the Apache warrior, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time. Instead of the savage enemy he had created in his imagination, he saw a weathered man not unlike himself, someone who had loved and lost, who had fought for his people's survival, who carried the weight of difficult choices. "You could have killed me years ago," Hutchins said, understanding dawning in his voice. "When I was traveling alone between settlements, when I was vulnerable. You had opportunities." "Many opportunities," Ashki confirmed. "But killing you would have made me what you believed I already was. Catherine taught me that we become what we choose to fight against, unless we choose something better to fight for." The philosophical weight of this observation seemed to physically stagger Hutchins. He had spent so much energy creating enemies that he had forgotten they might choose not to be his enemies in return. "The children," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "The Apache children who died in those staged raids. They weren't part of any war. They were just children. Like me," Melody said gently. "Like the white children you thought you were protecting. Like all children everywhere who just want to grow up safe and loved." Sheriff Coleman found himself holding his breath as he watched the mayor's internal struggle play out on his weathered face. Years of frontier law enforcement had taught him to recognize the moment when a desperate man either surrendered to better angels or chose final violence. Everything in Hutchins's posture suggested that this moment had arrived. "I can't take it back," Hutchins said, tears beginning to track down his cheeks. "All the death, all the hatred I've stirred up, I can't undo any of it." "No," Melody agreed, "but you can stop making it worse. You can choose to tell the truth instead of more lies. You can choose to help heal the damage instead of causing more." The gun in Hutchins' hand began to lower slowly, as if it had become too heavy to hold. His breathing grew ragged as years of carefully maintained justifications crumbled around him, leaving only the raw truth of what he had become. "They'll hang me," he said simply. "When they learn what I've done, they'll hang me." "Maybe," Captain Morrison said quietly, "but that's better than living as someone who points guns at children to protect his lies. And maybe," Bidsey added with the wisdom of her years, "a man who chooses truth over lies in his final moments lives more fully than one who dies defending hatred." Hutchins looked around at the faces surrounding him, Apache and white, adult and child, all watching to see what choice he would make in this moment that would define not just his fate, but the future of their shared community. "Catherine," he said quietly, speaking to Melody, but addressing the memory of her mother. "Tell me what she would have wanted me to do." Melody reached out slowly and placed her small hand over his weathered one, where it gripped the gun. "She would have wanted you to choose love over fear," she said simply. "She would have wanted you to help build the peace she died for, instead of destroying it." The warmth of the child's touch seemed to break the last of Hutchins' resistance. With a sound that was half sob and half prayer, he let the gun fall from his trembling fingers, choosing redemption over revenge, truth over the lies that had consumed his soul. The sound of Mayor Hutchins's gun hitting the dusty ground seemed to echo across the prairie, like a bell tolling the end of one era and the beginning of another. For a moment, no one moved, as if the simple act of choosing peace over violence required time to settle into the reality of their shared world. Then Thomas McKenna stepped forward and gathered his niece into his arms, his weathered hands shaking as he held her close. "Melody," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "you could have been killed." "But I wasn't," she replied simply, her small arms wrapping around his neck. "And now, maybe the killing can stop." Captain Morrison moved quickly to secure Hutchins's weapon while Sheriff Coleman placed the broken mayor under arrest, but there was no resistance left in the man who had orchestrated so much violence. He sat heavily on the farmhouse steps, his head in his hands, looking older than his years. 27 people, Hutchins said quietly, his voice carrying across the morning air. 27 innocent people died because of my lies and manipulation. Apache families, white settlers, even children, all sacrificed for a dream that turned into a nightmare. Bidsey approached him slowly, her weathered face showing the kind of compassion that only comes from a lifetime of understanding human frailty. "The first step toward healing is acknowledging the wound," she said gently. "You have taken that step. How can you speak kindly to me?" Hutchins asked, looking up at her with red-rimmed eyes. "I've caused so much pain to your people. Because hatred is a poison that destroys the one who carries it," Bidsy replied. "I'm too old to waste my remaining years feeding anger that changes nothing." Ashki knelt down and picked up a handful of prairie soil, letting it run through his weathered fingers. "This land has drunk enough blood," he said quietly. "Apache blood, white blood, the blood of children who never had a chance to choose between war and peace. Perhaps it is time to water it with something else." Captain Morrison finished securing the scene and turned his attention to the broader implications of what had been revealed. "Hutchins, I need you to provide a full confession detailing your conspiracy with the railroad interests. Names, dates, financial arrangements, everything." "You'll have it," Hutchins said without hesitation. "Every detail of how we manipulated territorial policy, staged false attacks, and murdered anyone who threatened our plans. The territorial government, the railroad executives, the local officials who were bought, all of it." Sheriff Coleman shook his head in amazement. "The scope of this thing, it reaches all the way to Washington, doesn't it?" "Further than you can imagine," Hutchins confirmed. "The Apache weren't the only targets. Any group that stood in the way of railroad development was marked for elimination or removal. We told ourselves we were bringing civilization to the wilderness, but we were really just bringing greed and violence dressed up in pretty words." Melody listened to these revelations with the serious attention of someone who understood that adult conversations sometimes contain truths too important to ignore. "Mayor Hutchins," she said quietly, "what about the other people? The ones who helped you, will they stop now that you've been caught?" The question struck at the heart of Hutchins's remaining fears. "They'll try to silence me before I can testify," he said with grim certainty. "Dead men can't reveal conspiracies." "Then we'll make sure you stay alive long enough to tell the truth," Morrison said firmly. "And we'll make sure that truth reaches the right people in Washington." "What about here?" Melody asked, gesturing toward the town that lay beyond the prairie horizon. "What about Cedar Ridge? Will people there listen to the truth?" Thomas McKenna considered his niece's question seriously. "Some will," he said finally. "Others have invested too much in their hatred to give it up easily. Change doesn't happen overnight, especially when it challenges everything people thought they knew. But it can happen," Bidsy said with quiet conviction. "Catherine proved that. Her work with our women, her willingness to see past fear to friendship, that proved change was possible." Nasha, who had remained quietly observant throughout the dramatic confrontation, now stepped forward with something in her weathered hands. "We brought something," she said, offering a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin to Melody. The child unwrapped the gift carefully, revealing a beautiful quilt that took her breath away. The fabric showed the careful work of many hands, Apache and white, working together to create something that honored both traditions while transcending their divisions. "Your mother began this," Nasha explained, "teaching us new stitching patterns while learning our traditional designs. When she died, we continued the work, hoping someday to finish it for her daughter." Melody ran her small fingers over the intricate patterns that told the story of two peoples learning to see each other as human beings rather than enemies. The quilt was more than just a gift. It was a promise, a symbol of the kind of future her mother had died trying to create. "It's beautiful," she whispered, tears starting to flow for the first time since this incredible day had begun. "Mama would have loved seeing it finished." "She did see it," Bidsy said gently, "not with her eyes, but with her heart. She saw the possibility of what could be built when people choose understanding over fear." Captain Morrison watched this exchange with growing awareness of the historic moment he was witnessing. Here, in a dusty farmyard where violence and hatred had been transformed into hope and healing, the future of territorial relations was being rewritten by the courage of a 7-year-old girl and the wisdom of women who had chosen peace over perpetual war. "We have work to do," he announced to the assembled group. "Testimony to record, conspirators to arrest, and policies to change. But first, we have something more important to accomplish." "What's that?" Sheriff Coleman asked. Morrison looked around at the faces surrounding him, Apache and white, young and old, all united by their shared commitment to Catherine McKenna's vision of peace. "We have a promise to keep," he said simply. "A promise. To finish the work that Catherine started, to build the kind of community she believed was possible." 6 months later, the autumn sun painted the prairie around Cedar Ridge in shades of gold and amber that seemed to promise better days ahead. The town had changed in ways both subtle and profound, shaped by the revelations that had emerged from a dusty farmyard where a child's courage had transformed hatred into hope. The McKenna farm bustled with activity as families from both communities worked together to prepare for the harvest festival that had become a symbol of their new cooperation. Thomas and Ruth McKenna had indeed moved back to the old homestead, but they had not come alone. The farm now served as a school where Apache and white children learned together, taught by teachers who understood that education was the foundation of lasting peace. Melody, now 8 years old and thriving in ways that would have seemed impossible a year ago, moved between the groups with the easy confidence of someone who had learned that bridges between peoples were built one friendship at a time. She wore the beautiful quilt that Nasha and the other Apache women had finished, its patterns telling the story of cooperation triumphing over conflict. 6 months later, the autumn sun painted the prairie around Cedar Ridge in shades of gold and amber that seemed to promise better days ahead. The town had changed in ways both subtle and profound, shaped by the revelations that had emerged from a dusty farmyard where a child's courage had transformed hatred into hope. The McKenna farm bustled with activity as families from both communities worked together to prepare for the harvest festival that had become a symbol of their new cooperation. Thomas and Ruth McKenna had indeed moved back to the old homestead, but they had not come alone. The farm now served as a school where Apache and white children learned together, taught by teachers who understood that education was the foundation of lasting peace. Melody, now 8 years old and thriving in ways that would have seemed impossible a year ago, moved between the groups with the easy confidence of someone who had learned that bridges between peoples were built one friendship at a time. She wore the beautiful quilt that Nasha and the other Apache women had finished, its patterns telling the story of cooperation triumphing over conflict. "Miss Melody," called out one of her younger students, a 6-year-old Apache boy named Tavi, who had quickly become one of her favorite pupils. "Will you help me with the English words for the harvest song?" Melody smiled and knelt beside him, her patient voice guiding him through the pronunciation of words that would allow him to participate fully in the celebration. Nearby, his sister worked with Ruth McKenna to prepare traditional Apache bread, alongside settler recipes, their laughter mixing in the warm afternoon air. Ashki emerged from the barn, where he had been helping Thomas repair equipment for the coming winter. The Apache warrior had become a permanent fixture at the farm, serving as a bridge between the communities and helping to train a new generation of peacekeepers. His weathered face showed the peace that comes from living in harmony with one's principles. "The young ones learn quickly when fear is not their teacher," he observed, watching Melody work with her students. "Catherine always believed that," Thomas replied, wiping his hands on a work rag. "She said children's hearts were naturally open until adults taught them to close." The changes had not come without struggle. Mayor Hutchins' confession had sent shockwaves through the territorial government, leading to investigations that reached all the way to Washington. Several railroad executives faced federal charges, and new policies had been implemented to prevent the kind of manipulation that had nearly led to war. Hutchins himself remained in federal custody, but his cooperation with investigators had been complete and invaluable. His detailed testimony had exposed a network of corruption that spanned multiple territories, saving countless lives by preventing similar conspiracies elsewhere. Captain Morrison, who had been promoted following his handling of the crisis, arrived at the farm with his usual military bearing softened by genuine warmth. "How are our young diplomats progressing?" he asked, watching the mixed group of children working together. "Better than their elders in many ways," Bidsy replied, approaching, from where she had been supervising the preparation of traditional foods. The Apache grandmother had become a regular presence at the farm, her wisdom helping to guide the careful process of building trust between former enemies. "Speaking of progress," Morrison said, his expression growing serious, "I have news from the territorial capital. The new Apache Settler Cooperation Accord has been ratified by Congress. Your mother's dream," he added, looking at Melody, "has become official federal policy." The news rippled through the gathered families like a stone dropped in still water. What had begun as one woman's personal mission to build bridges had evolved into a model for peaceful coexistence that would be implemented across the American frontier. "What does that mean exactly?" Ruth asked, pausing in her work. "It means formal recognition of mixed community settlements," Morrison explained. "Federal protection for integrated schools, shared water rights, and cooperative economic development. Most importantly, it means that what you've built here will be supported rather than threatened by government policy." Melody felt a warm sensation in her chest as she realized that her mother's sacrifice had not been in vain. Catherine McKenna's belief in the possibility of peace had survived her death, growing stronger through the courage of those who chose to continue her work. As the afternoon wore on, families from both communities continued arriving for the harvest celebration. The festival had evolved into something unprecedented, a gathering that honored both Apache and settler traditions, while creating new customs that belonged to their shared community. Sheriff Coleman arrived with his family, his initial skepticism about the mixed community having given way to genuine appreciation for the peace it had brought to the region. Even some of the townspeople who had initially opposed the changes had been won over by the practical benefits of cooperation. "Hard to argue with prosperity," Coleman observed to Thomas as they watched children from both communities playing together without a trace of the fear or hostility that had once defined relations between their peoples. "Hard to argue with happiness," Thomas replied, watching his niece teach a group of mixed children a game that seemed to involve elements from both cultures. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the entire gathering came together for the evening meal. Apache and settler families sat side by side, sharing food and stories, their laughter carrying across the prairie like a song of hope. Melody stood before the assembled crowd, her small voice carrying clearly in the peaceful evening air. "My Mama used to say that every act of kindness was a seed that could grow into something beautiful if we took care of it properly. Tonight, I can see her garden blooming all around us." She paused, looking out at the faces that reflected the light of the fires, Apache and white, young and old, all united by their commitment to building something better than the hatred that had nearly destroyed them all. She also said that home isn't a place, it's the people who choose to love each other despite their differences. Tonight, looking at all of you, I think I finally understand what she meant. Bidsy rose slowly, her weathered hands holding a ceremonial talking stick that had been passed down through generations of Apache leaders. "Catherine McKenna's daughter speaks with wisdom beyond her years," she said, her voice carrying the authority of earned respect. "But she also speaks with the heart of her mother, a heart that chose love over fear, hope over hatred, peace over perpetual war." Ashki stood next, accepting the talking stick with reverence. "In our tradition, we believe that some spirits are too strong to be contained by death. Catherine's spirit lives on in her daughter, in this community, in every choice we make to see enemies as potential friends." The talking stick passed from hand to hand, each person sharing their gratitude for the peace that had been built from the ashes of mistrust and violence. Children spoke alongside adults, their innocent wisdom often cutting straight to the heart of complex truths. As the evening drew to a close and families began preparing for the journey home, Melody found herself standing with Ashki at the edge of the farm, looking out over the prairie that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "Do you think she can see us?" Melody asked quietly. "Do you think Mama knows what we've built here?" Ashki was quiet for a long moment, his weathered face thoughtful in the starlight. "I think," he said finally, "that love this strong doesn't die when the body dies. I think it grows stronger, spreading from heart to heart, until it becomes something larger than any one person could create alone, like a family," Melody said, understanding dawning in her young voice. "Like a really big family that includes everyone who chooses to belong." "Exactly like that," Ashki agreed, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "And tonight, looking at all these people who have chosen to belong to something bigger than their fears, I think your mother's dream has come true." As they stood together in the peaceful darkness, surrounded by the sounds of laughter and conversation, from the continuing celebration, Melody felt a deep sense of completion. She had lost her parents to hatred and fear, but she had gained something precious in return, a community bound together by the understanding that love was stronger than division, that hope was more powerful than despair, that a child's courage could indeed change the world. The prairie wind carried the scents of autumn and the sounds of celebration across the endless grassland, where two peoples had learned to see each other not as enemies, but as neighbors in the grand human family that Catherine McKenna had always believed was possible. And in that wind, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear the whisper of a woman's voice saying that home, at last, had been found.